Chapter 1. The Cannon's Roar. Austungrad was shaking. It was shaking as if it had felt fear for what was happening on the surface. The speed at which Leviathan had broken through the first wall had staggered everybody. Not at the speed that it was overwhelmed. That was inevitable. But the speed at which it actually got through the first wall. Tiny imperfections, small cracks that the blight plague biomass could easily leak through. Then, when there was enough, pure forms would form. When the first wall fell, it was only at the western gatehouse. As a result, the remaining forces were ordered to retreat, and whilst only a small fraction of them would actually make it to the second wall, nevertheless, the forces would be invaluable. But now that Leviathan had gotten through the first wall, and now had free reign across the entirety of it, to leech through the walls in any place that it could find, it was an unstoppable onslaught, only being held off by three specific things. The first was the mighty roar of the Queston cannons on the second wall. What they lacked for sheer rate of fire, they had for overwhelming range and pure destructive nuclear-level damage. Then, of course, there were the mastodons, jury-rigged artillery platforms that were created in the last few years before Leviathan attacked. Woefully inefficient, but could keep up a rate of fire that was superb and superior to any other form of artillery. The final thing was the Mithra airstrikes. Aircraft going at multiple Mach speeds, screaming across the sky and carpet-bombing massive swathes of land. For now, Leviathan was held back, but every single moment that passed, every single second that passed where the Questons did not fire, and every single few minutes that it took for the Mastodons to reload, Leviathan gained ground farther and farther. However, the forces on the front lines were not alone. It was the Siritan Royal Army, whatever volunteers of the Siritan civilian caste that had decided to fight, as well as the ever-prestigious Siritan Royal Vanguard, their thermokinetic wave projectors barking in their hands, taking out targets at excessively long range. Not only this, but they were assisted by multiple medium and heavy tanks, and even a few super heavy tanks sprinkled in here and there. It was to everybody's shock when once more the gates started to open. However, this time it didn't let out a single occupant. It let out legions. With a mighty war bellow of belligerent pride, the Siritan war machines walked onto the field. Finally, it was their time to fight. Lieutenant Strand was petrified. He had been called not to the second wall, not to the third or the fourth wall, as he had expected. Rather, he was called to the one place that he never thought that he would see, the Central Command Nexus. Not only that, but he was at the very beating heart of it all. And before him were perhaps three of the most intimidating individuals he had personally ever met. Standing at the console at the very center of the room was none other than the Siritan Empress, Lady Molly Jackson, and the Siritan strategist himself, Lord Isaiah. Out of the corner of his eye, Strand also recognized one of the Siritan calamities, the Crimson Samurai, Benimaru. Strand had been standing there for what felt like days, but was most likely no more than 2 minutes. Everybody had their back to him, with the exception of Lord Benimaru in the corner. He didn't say anything. The fact of the matter is that even if he wanted to, he couldn't. He was far too scared of the people that were before him. These were some of the most legendary individuals in all of the Siritan Empire, one of the newly created fabled Siritan calamities. The Siritan strategist, after all, there was nobody that didn't know him, and the Siritan Empress herself, wife to the living god of the Siritan Emperor. After a few more minutes had passed, the Winter General finally spoke. "Lieutenant Strond, I assume." A spike of pure fear and adrenaline shot through Strond's body as he was finally addressed. However, once more, the Winter General didn't turn around to look at him. "I've been looking over your service record. I have to say, for such a short term, it's rather surprising. I have a special assignment that I need done, and I require capable individuals like yourself to carry them out. I will not lie to you. There is a non-0% chance that you won't come back alive. The fact of the matter is that depending on how this war goes, I may end up asking you to sacrifice your own life. As a result, this is purely optional. I won't force you to do this." Finally, Isaiah turned, and Strond immediately regretted looking at the back of his head, as now he came eye to eye with the Winter General himself. Those piercing, icy blue eyes that seemed to see right through a man to his very core and know their worth. It was perhaps one of the most terrifying things he had ever seen. Of all of the different Xenos, of all of the different factions that he had fought against, these eyes were perhaps the most horrifying, the most terrifying. He then looked down and saw that Isaiah was holding a data pad, and, shockingly enough, it was Strond's service record. With a deft tap of his thumb, he switched the screen to what appeared to be blueprints of a massive underground network. Isaiah held out the data pad and Strond took it. Upon further inspection, he realized that it was the entirety of the service networks beneath the whole city of Austungrad. One specific point in it, near the first wall, had been pinged with a small icon. "I need you to go to this location. There'll be another man assisting you, and you'll be taking 2 items of significance. The first we'll simply just call the coffin. You don't need to know what's in it, and for the love of everything, don't open it. You don't want to know what's in there. The other is a bit of insurance, just to make sure that everything goes right. Go to these coordinates and await further instructions. That is all." The Winter General turned around once more and walked back to the console, assessing the situation of the war. Strond, solely focused on the datapad, momentarily forgotten the 3 individuals that were before him. He turned around smartly and walked out the door. Isaiah hadn't even registered that Strond had left at that point, his entire focus solely on the battle at hand. Needless to say, it was going better than he had imagined. The Mithra airstrikes and the artillery were able to hold it off Leviathan for the most part, given the fact that they were arrayed across the entirety of the second wall. With the addition of the Siritan war machines and some of the heavier weapons that they could bring to bear, and the fact that they massively outranged anything else, they were managing to hold back Leviathan. The only thing that stood between Leviathan and the forces of the second wall was a few hundred miles of what was once residential districts, but was now quickly becoming a no-man's land filled with nothing more than debris. He looked over the statistics of the mastodons. They wouldn't be able to be in play for very long. Whilst Austungrad's manufacturing capacity was incredible as far as fortress cities go, it wasn't going to be able to keep up with the sheer drain that the mastodons had, the sheer rate of fire that they had. They were woefully inefficient. The fact of the matter is that Isaiah knew that they were going to need volume versus overall firepower. Thus, the mastodons. In hindsight, Isaiah realized just how poor of a decision this was. He had taken multiple super heavy battle tanks and taken their turrets off of them, stripping them down as much as possible and keeping an overwhelming amount of space for nothing more than artillery shells. Then strapping a total of 4 120mm artillery cannons on it. The shells themselves weren't anything to write home about. They were relatively weak, but in mass fire they were capable of getting the job done. The barrels themselves had been reinforced to be able to handle the sheer rate that it was firing at. However, due to the fact that there simply just wasn't enough space within the mastodons themselves, trailers had to be attached to them, the shells themselves put into massive belts so that they could be belt-fed into each of the chambers. Otherwise, the rate of fire would be woefully inefficient. He then looked to the Questons. They had an overwhelming amount of ammunition for those. Likely, they wouldn't run out, even by the end of this war. This is due to the fact that the Questons, whilst incredible artillery pieces capable of saturating a massive area in devastation, weren't capable of being fired quickly due to the sheer weight of each of the shells, the Questons themselves being well over 300 millimeters. Finally, there was the Mithra airstrikes. Their bombs would eventually run out, but luckily Isaiah had thought ahead, at least for that. They had multiple different payloads, everything from brute force kinetics to energy-based, even thermal and acidic shells. As a result of them constantly cycling them in and out and having multiple different bomb variants in each run, they were capable of elongating the time in which it took for ammunition to run out. Finally, there were the Siritan war machines. That was perhaps their biggest issue. The Siritan war machines depended on warehouses that supplied them of their weapons of their ammunition via tether relay portals. The fact of the matter is that the majority of them didn't have warehouses anymore, and those that did, warehouses that were quickly made in advance, simply weren't capable of holding the same level of ammunition. As a result, they would have to fire for far shorter periods of time before having to go through an extensive rearming. That, needless to say, was not ideal. However, Isaiah did have a plan. A specific individual that he could deploy right now to the battlefield, and in fact was already being deployed to the northeast. This individual would be essential, as it would provide an overwhelming amount of military assets that could be redistributed to other locations around the walls. This individual was none other than one of the top 5 natural disasters, this being Rhinel Ezekiel, the Prince of Elements, one of the newly discovered natural disasters. The fact of the matter is that the 10 great natural disasters was still around, he would be a fairly high-ranking member of it, perhaps even outranking Isaiah himself. Rhinel could hold the line for an exceptionally long amount of time, assuming, of course, that it kept his attention, which in of itself was a 50-50 possibility. Rhinel had a nasty habit of getting distracted by various different things, oftentimes the books that he would bring into the battlefield with him, and whilst Isaiah had no doubt that he'd be able to protect his own life, he wasn't exactly sure that he'd be able to focus enough to protect his entire section of the wall. That, however, was a problem for a different time, because right now he had something far more pressing. The first Western Gatehouse had fallen. Not metaphorically, but literally. Whatever Leviathan had been doing at the Western Gatehouse of the First Wall It appears as though it was doing structural damage, as the entire gatehouse collapsed in on itself, burying a massive section of the wall. That in of itself was absurd. The walls themselves were a mile thick. They were designed to be impenetrable, save the most extreme militaries. The fact that Leviathan somehow collapsed a mile-thick area of the wall was mind-boggling. Isaiah, at the very least, took heart in the fact knowing that Leviathan likely lost a significant amount of forces underneath the gatehouse itself, which it had already destroyed the gates. On the front lines, the situation was looking relatively optimistic. The soldiers of the Civitan Royal Army were largely preparing for the battle. It would likely be a number of days before Leviathan finally reached the second wall, or at the very least reached the maximum range of most weapons. This is due to the fact that the distance between the peninsula and the first wall was relatively short. Leviathan had a very short amount of distance that it had to go, but between the first and second walls was multiple hundreds of miles of non-stop buildings and terrain. It would take them an extraordinarily long amount of time. Already 4 days had passed since the first wall had officially been breached by Leviathan. Already a quite literal flood of blight plague infected were storming towards the second walls, being held off by nothing more than airstrikes and artillery. However, the first signs that Leviathan was actually making progress happened when a singular super heavy battle tank fired its main cannon. It turns out Leviathan was just barely within its maximum range, and all across the front lines, super heavy battle tanks fired their primary cannons. Once more, just like with the Questons, what they lacked for sheer rate of fire, they gained in incredible range and unbelievable destructive capabilities. Whilst not nearly on the level of Questons, they could certainly put massive craters into the battlefield, depending on what they shot. It also helped that the cannons of super heavy battle tanks were capable of going vertical, turning themselves into miniature artillery pieces. The other sign that Leviathan was approaching was the direct fire artillery cannons on the very top of the second wall, which had started to open fire. A non-stop drumbeat of artillery and cannon fire was all that they heard, as the Civitan Royal Vanguard members, at least those who had sniper configurations available to them, were still firing off, picking off particularly large blight plague infected forms. Eventually, however, a number of them started to change the configuration of their weapons, favoring a much higher rate of fire for extreme range. As a result, they started to saturate the entire battlefield. Whilst the majority of energy waves would fail to hit the enemy, that in of itself didn't matter. The energy canisters that served as their ammunition were incredibly plentiful, and were very easily distributed to the soldiers and even easier to produce. As a result, wasteful firing, whilst never exactly ideal, was allowable. The purpose wasn't to suppress Leviathan. Each and every single pure form had no form of self-preservation. Rather, it was to pick off as many of them as quickly as possible at excessive range. Sniper fire simply just wasn't efficient at this point. As a result, they saturated the entire battlefield. Waves of heat and a constant drumbeat of thermokinetic waves being fired was all around the soldiers. Isaiah saw something that he wasn't exactly happy about. The display had showed that the Leviathan was once more pushing excessively hard to the west. A massive amount of pure forms as well as a few abominations were closing in. Whilst the Questons, Mastodons, Siritan war machines, and the cannons of the super heavy battle tanks could deal with the majority of things, abominations would be significantly more difficult. Whilst the Siritan war machines would not struggle once they got within close range, trying to hit them with any form of artillery was nigh impossible due to the rate that they moved. Even leading the artillery shells themselves oftentimes proved to be nothing more than a miss than a direct hit. And behind them, Isaiah already saw a massive host of Plague Fathers forming from the biomass that was leaking from the first wall, and now, as he observed, was starting to breach over the top of the rubble of the western gatehouse. Once again, not exactly ideal, but Isaiah had a plan. The only problem was whether or not this plan could actually bear any fruit. He sent a single data pulse to a very specific vessel in orbit, a Galavier frigate, who was by far the closest to low orbital anchor. The battle that was raging up there was nothing more than a battle of preservation. The ships themselves could do nothing to hold back Leviathan. However, a single frigate, if it could maneuver itself correctly, could prove invaluable by firing its broadsides as a lance strike. As a result, he sent the data packet and awaited a response. Strand skulked. It wasn't exactly the perfect word for the situation, but it nevertheless did what he was doing justice. They had been going through the tunnels for what seemed like hours. Himself, this quote-unquote coffin, which Strand immediately recognized had a temporal stasis field within it, as well as the secondary bit of insurance, and his companion. His companion hadn't even spoken to him yet, or at least not much. They said that they understood the mission and were willing to do whatever was necessary, no matter the cost. However, they hadn't provided a name. The first thing was the coffin. Strand wasn't exactly sure what was in it, and if Isaiah was to be believed, he didn't want to know. But he knew a temporal stasis field when he saw one, or rather, when he felt one. A bit of an odd bit of technology. It had a strange aura around it, an aura of almost wrongness, that something isn't the way that it's supposed to be. It's a near indescribable feeling of knowing that time is different from one area to the next. As for the bit of insurance, Strand immediately knew what it was as well. He had spent enough time around plasmite bombs to know them. The strange, static-filled feeling within the air. The subtle pink hue that wasn't quite on the visual spectrum, as it emitted no light. Yet it surrounded the bomb in its entirety, and the constant uneasy feeling that Strand had always associated being near something that destructive. The fact of the matter is that if it ever got detonated, not only would it vaporize them as well as this coffin, but likely take down a massive section of the underground tunnels. They had finally reached the final corridor. From this point, whilst it would be several hundred miles, it was a straight shot. There would be other branches, but for the most part they wouldn't have to turn. On their way here, they had already came into contact with multiple battalion strong forces. Each and every single time they passed, Strand would simply give them a head nod, knowing that neither of them were going to see each other once more, and both knowing that neither of them were likely to come back alive. They had their own task, though, and as they turned the corner into the final corridor, Strand immediately hated everything. The corridor was pitch black. It had appeared as though power had been lost in this sector, whether it be a technical fault or Leviathan breaching in, or perhaps even a collapse somewhere that had cut off the grid. Strawn didn't know. The corridors themselves were claustrophobic, barely being wide enough to permit the coffin as well as the plasmide bomb, never mind Strawn and his companion. The walls themselves were completely bare save for incredibly thin, fragile-looking wires that connected to each of the overhead lights. Everything was a dull, mute gray, seemingly devoid of all color and feeling. That being said, the equipment that they had been given was something else. This was normally the type of stuff that was given to special forces within the Silverton Royal Army. Certainly soldiers of Strawn's rank and caliber would never dream of having this stuff. The first thing was Praetor power armor. Heavy-duty armor designed with as much offense as defense. It was designed as an unaugmented version of the Silverton Marines' 1st Division's armor, this being the Praetorian Guard and their fabled War Tortoise. It was incredibly powerful. Nothing save for the most heavy of impacts and fire would be able to punch through its armor plating. Not only this, but it even had autonomous weapons mounted across the armor itself. The only problem was the undersuit beneath the armor itself. Whilst the biomass would have no chance of chewing through the armor itself, at least not before Strawn could destroy it, the undersuit was a different matter entirely, significantly weaker, designed for flexibility and mobility, despite the fact that such things weren't usually particularly important when you were using power armor. It was designed as a way of punching through enemy lines, rather than being fast and nimble. The fact of the matter is that both of them were agonizingly slow because of its overwhelming weight. Not only this, but the systems weren't as fine-tuned as that of the Silverton Marines, largely due to the fact that it was in a significantly smaller area. Every once in a while, the hydraulics would seemingly not be able to keep up with his weight, and for a fraction of a second, Strawn would feel the full weight of the suit on his body before the hydraulics once more re-engaged and the weight was taken off of him. It was like an entire mountain range had suddenly been put on his shoulders every once in a while. The other bit of equipment that they had access to was that of antimatter carbines, and it instantly made Strawn incredibly nervous. He held the weapon out forward as if it might suddenly become animate and bite him. The fact of the matter is that if anything went wrong with this rifle, it would completely and utterly obliterate him. There would be nothing left. Not a corpse, not a suit of armor, not a strand of hair. His entire body completely and utterly obliterated. As they continued down the corridor, all that they had to see was the lamps on the side of their helmets, illuminating the corridor, and whilst it certainly went out a few 100 feet, it nevertheless wasn't ideal. That's when Strawn saw something. There wasn't a corridor or an intersection up ahead, yet he saw something. A pool of shadow, darker than the darkness around him. It almost seemed like a figure as it flickered from left to right. Strawn immediately stopped and raised his weapon. Without any hesitation, and not knowing of the situation, his partner immediately stopped as well, almost as if he had eyes in the back of his head. Strawn scanned the area for what must have been a few minutes, but didn't see anything. He advanced very slowly. His partner held his ground just in case, despite the fact that no communications had been sent between the two. When he finally reached the location that he thought he saw something, he saw that it was nothing more than bare walls and the corridor stretching ever onward in front of him. Strawn said a click through the comm system, and the coffin, the plasmite bomb, and his companion, who still had his back to him, started to progress down the hall. Whatever he had seen, it wasn't there now, if it ever had been to begin with.